Welcome to the Radical Middle Podcast, where we believe the right solutions start with asking the right questions. With your host, Thomas McMurtry.
Hello there. Welcome back to the Radical Middle. I'm your host, Thomas McMurtry here, and I'm joined by my dear friend Ian Hull again for another video on our series here on real estate, the Canadian economy, and productive investment. Hi, Ian. How are you doing?
Great, Thomas. Nice to see you again. And I'm really excited. We're in now to our multiple podcasts and we're getting in some more deep material. But I just think it might be helpful for the listeners to get a better sense of, not a better sense, a rehash, a little bit of repeat about what we've been covering in our podcast number 1 and then number 2. So can you just sort of succinctly tell me a little bit about what we covered in the first one and then how it morphed into the second one? Because the third topic we're going to cover today really is another crowning achievement in some of the research you've done through some of the great professors you've been working with.
Great, Ian. I thought we could summarize a little bit of what we've covered so far. We're looking at how the structural investment in real estate in Canada has affected really productive business. That's really the main focus of how can we get this Canadian economy productive again. I think it's a salient topic now. And the dynamics that I've been researching are how has real estate taken away from that economy? So we kind of looked at that a little bit. In the first episode, we covered a lot of ground. The last episode, we looked at how banks create money, which I think is an interesting piece of this puzzle. When we understand that the credit creation theory of banking is really how banking functions and how money is created in our economy. And there's a real key distinction there that becomes relevant for this discussion in that if this new money is being created and funneled into asset speculation or asset appreciation, we're looking at, first of all, divestment away from productive businesses, but also inflationary trends there, right? So that's a key piece. I also wanted to pause quickly because I feel like I haven't been giving enough due diligence or credit to the economies who I owe great debt, the economists, pardon me, who I owe a great debt to. So during my research, Stephen Keen, an economist from Australia, has been really helpful. Michael Hudson in framing a lot of this topic, and really good work on the quantity theory of credit is Richard Werner, a German economist who invented the term quantitative easing. So these are good sources if people are looking to go deeper again, and also to not take my word for it. Again, the Bank of England confirms, as well as the Bundesbank in 2017, that banks do actually endogenously create credit when they lend. So, I don't know if I made a lot of sense there. I just want to highlight quickly, again, we saw this graphic before. Can you see my screen here?
You bet.
So what we talked about is basically that this huge increase here in mortgage credit, this is as a percentage of GDP. So the raw numbers are obviously much larger, and that's the blue line. The idea is that when you felt our assets increasing, our housing going up, it's this illusion of wealth, essentially, because you think, okay, that means our country must be getting richer because people can buy more houses because they're saving. But that's where that credit piece comes in, that actually these houses, this is not fueled by household savings or income that's coming in. It's new money creation, right? So it's that, in that sense, it's sort of an illusion of wealth, and that helps explain our huge debt to income ratio increase here, right? Why the majority of bank lending is to the real estate sector, usually about 80% in Western countries. So that's where you see this ballooning debt to buy these assets that are appreciating, but it's not necessarily coming from savings. That's the key point in that credit creation, if that makes sense.
Well, it sure does. And I guess that's the point that, the illusion of savings is something that is so important to your generation. Our generation probably overspent at a rate that is it's striking. I mean, I've heard recently that in Canada, the OAS payments that are made to seniors, it is an artificial benefit to our generation, and my generation not quite yet, to the ones that I'm just under that age, because whereas the younger generation aren't getting that same sort of tax benefit, and we're really essentially overpaying our older generation at this point, and at the year level, it's really difficult to save. And so if you're not creating savings and you're overpaying the non-productive part of the economy, it seems to me a bad cycle.
Yeah, that's why this research was really interesting to me, right? As our generation, you see that chart, the hockey sticks looks good for if you're on the ladder, but you're trying to figure out how are we going to get into this game, and how are we going to fuel that? And so, the other factor is the risk factor to the economy is much enlarged when you have this huge debt overhead. So, God forbid there's an economic crisis around the corner. We're coming to Canada. This makes the recovery a lot more painful, and potentially a lot more long lasting if you have this huge overhang.
All right. So then in front of that, of course, is and it's so funny. There's a great show in the mornings. John Moore leads a News Talk 1010, and he talks about your generation as the ones sitting outside the rope. And he says that one of his theories was the way he described it was that you're going into a bar or a club and you're in line, and then all of a sudden the rope stops and they say no more people coming in. And we're the ones in the rope, and we're the ones dancing on the floor, and you guys are sitting there outside, never to get in. So with that kind of stress on the economy, things like your ideas about making sure that we get more productive investment, and we try to alert the banks to stop just, and the governments to tell banks, stop just lending against real estate. It's
Hmm.
sucking the good money out of the system. And then you
Yeah.
talked about how the banks are kind of manufacturing money in that sense in your second podcast. So those two pressure points on you guys outside the rope brings me to the third point, and that is, tell us a little bit about what's the difference between productive and extractive income, and what are we getting at with that kind of concept?
Yeah, that's great. I liked your anecdote there. I mean, I've heard it called rule by gerontocracy. And we have a lot of aging populations across the world generally. And the wealth seems to be concentrated in those generations. So, what I'm trying to do with the radical middle here is provide some nuance and some new solutions, to maybe break some of the paradigms that the older generations are stuck in for the ways that we accumulate wealth, and thinking, for new innovative ways to unlock our creative potential, really, right? And that goes back to your question. The history of political economy is sort of grounding this. The original political economists, circa the time of Adam Smith, right? Which is coming up on 100. I saw it in a magazine, 150-year anniversary. People love the invisible hand, but he only mentioned that about once or twice in his writing. But what they were really focused on at this time was industrialization, right? The end of the 18th century. And you have this feudal legacy, and there's this overhang of, wealth was often derived from land, the landed aristocracy. And they were trying to figure out how can we make the economy productive, and sort of more, beneficial for all. But like they saw, there's economists as well, Ricardo, who proved it well, that the portion of the surplus income, as it's called, that goes towards the landlords will continue to increase as you take on more and more land. You have to use, it was in an agrarian context, but as you take on, you have to use more and more land. You're going to have this outsized portion going to the landowners, and less to the capitalists and the employees. And he was actually representing the banking class at the time. So, but ironically, those actually the banking and the landed real estate class, you could tell, or the landed elite, have sort of synthesized. But what happened over time was this distinction between productive and extractive income was blurred over the 20th century. But they were really focused on that. They saw the landlord class as sort of extractive because it's not producing any new products, innovation, or wealth, really, right? It's just taking from the existing system. whereas productive investment is in infrastructure or new businesses and new capital formation, which pays for itself and is a number one indicator of economic growth, right? So they were trying to figure out that balance, and that was sort of lost a little bit in the last century, where all income was sort of treated as equal, and we got into more complex modeling, and economics was separated from politics, whereas originally political economy, and it was a bit more philosophical and less embedded in mathematics per se, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So are we, as a consequence of the sort of combined efforts of the banks to lend against the wrong properties and the banks to just making money to do that, are we just essentially crushing the entrepreneurial availability for the entrepreneurial money, and combined with that crushing is this idea that we're really not looking at what's the difference between productive non-producing wealth and productive extractive wealth or income, I mean.
Yeah, exactly. And that, gets to more the conclusions of what's the result of this. But it's been the easy way to generate money, and it's played out in lots of different countries. And it makes sense. The incentives are there. You're lending against existing collateral, as we covered. And what happens though is you have an increased cost of doing business, and real estate continues to climb. And some people get that free lunch, but eventually that debt has to be paid. And all of this extraction of wealth has not produced any means for which to pay it off, right? So that's where, in the long run, this strategy is not necessarily viable, and we may be coming to that crunch moment. But to your question about entrepreneurs, that's also this part about, we left the ethics and the morality of the banks creating money aside. They If they're using that money to fuel entrepreneurs, new businesses, that can really be an engine of economic growth. That's the differentiation of the uses of that credit. So when it's going to existing assets, whether that's real estate speculation or other asset appreciation, it's not creating new wealth. Whereas if we were to invest in new businesses, or small businesses who are, really the backbone of the economy, then we would be able to hopefully sustain ourselves because they're going to keep producing new wealth, and be able to pay off those debts in the long run.
And I like the fact that the government in Canada anyway has at least identified some of this trend by the Business Development Bank is one of those options for entrepreneurs where they're taking on risk that may not be the conventional risk. But it does amaze me that the banking community generally, though, isn't more aware of this, because in the long run, as you've said, like we are hitting crunches. I mean, we're in a crunch right now in the real estate market in Canada. Whether we're going to come out of it or not I'm interested in your thoughts on that. But also, that can't be good for the longevity of the big five banks in any event. Like you'd think that there would be motivation to be more BDC bank entrepreneurial lending than they are, because we're in a lag now that only hurts everyone, including the banks.
Yeah, well, precisely. I mean, this is where the work I'm very interested in the work of Richard Werner, who believes in sort of a decentralized finance model. So I alluded to it in my last answer, which is that the majority of employment in the economy, 70-80%, is small, medium-sized businesses, SMEs or enterprises, right? And the fact of the matter is, the big banks, we have this, top heavy, as we call it, the monopoly economy of Canada, some people call it. They don't really lend to small businesses, right? Big banks do big business. And so he looks at models like the German economy in the past, where you have much more hundreds of small lenders, right? And if you're realizing that those banks have sort of a privilege to print money, you could say this is sort of a radical solution, if you will, but it's been done before in different countries in Europe, such as Germany. You allow for more local lending instead of having these big decisions made in these big institutions. And as you mentioned, you think they'd be on top of it. I'm sure there's a lot of smart people at the banks thinking about this, hopefully. But it's somewhat one of those things of the malaise of bureaucracy as well, right? Those big banks move slower. So if you were able to decentralize these systems, you might be able to promote much more innovation and small business lending.
Yeah, and this we need to start to really create a new culture of lending that gives more opportunity to entrepreneurs, which will feed the economy better, which is also going to give your generation much more likelihood of financial success, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to do a bit more detail on this, on the impacts of this rising real estate. But when you think about it, the rising rents that I talked about before in cities all across the world, right? There's not a lot of economic security in this, right? And I've heard this argument made, and often from the Bitcoin community or the Austrian school, as I said, they look at this inflation, especially focused in real estate. It just makes it hard to get by, right? And sort of the heyday of innovation is if you're not struggling to put food on the table, you might be able to, like the Wright brothers, invent some airplanes in your bike garage. That's where these breakthroughs can come if you're just not having to, really work. The whole family's working to just pay for the rent and get the kids into school. That's kind of what we're looking at.
Oh, that's so interesting. Well, listen, this is really helpful. I've kind of got now a third component of the analysis where your radical middle is sitting, and I'm really enjoying the discussion. So thanks so much for doing it today, and I look forward to our next get together and further discussion on this. So have a great day, Thomas.
Thanks a lot, Ian, for your help. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Radical Middle Podcast. Check out our show notes for further reading. For any inquiries, reach out at theradicalmiddlemedia@gmail.com.